2 weeks into the semester, Grace noticed how discrimination could wear different masks. Sometimes it came dressed as politeness, other times as oversight, but it was always there, hovering like a shadow she couldn't shake. During advanced chemistry, she discovered her lab partner had requested a switch, claiming scheduling conflicts. The same partner who'd barely spoken 3 words to her while copying her precise notes. Mr. Phillips had simply nodded and reassigned partners, leaving Grace alone at her station, while other tables had groups of 3. "It's actually better this way," Grace muttered to herself, carefully measuring chemicals for their experiment. "No one to mess up my measurements." But the empty seat beside her felt heavy with meaning. She couldn't help noticing how laughter and conversation flowed freely at other tables, while silence surrounded hers like a bubble. The science club rejection came via email, short and formal. "Due to unprecedented interest, we regret to inform you that all positions have been filled." Grace read it twice on her phone during lunch, sitting at her usual window seat. Just yesterday, she'd overheard 2 students discussing how the club needed more members. In English literature, they were studying To Kill a Mockingbird. The irony wasn't lost on Grace when discussion questions about prejudice and justice were met with awkward silences and averted gazes. Her raised hand remained unacknowledged until another student made the exact same point she'd been trying to make 5 minutes earlier, receiving enthusiastic praise from the teacher. Even her perfect scores seemed to work against her. After acing the first calculus test, whispers started circulating. She must have had access to the answers somehow, a girl named Rachel said loudly enough to be heard while passing Grace's desk. "My cousin goes to her old school, and they use the same textbooks." The lie stung, but Grace remembered her mother's words from that morning, "Your excellence is not up for debate." She'd been practicing these words in front of the mirror, along with the smile that showed confidence instead of hurt. During group projects, she found herself consistently alone until teachers intervened. When they did, her assigned group members would communicate through shared Google Docs rather than speak to her directly during class. Her suggestions, no matter how brilliant, were met with silent dismissal. One rainy afternoon, Grace stayed late to work on her science fair project. In the empty laboratory, she finally felt at peace, methodically recording data and cross-referencing research papers. The quiet was broken by voices approaching, members of the science club she hadn't been allowed to join. "Did you see her project proposal?" One voice carried through the door. "Neurodegenerative disease indicators, that's graduate-level research. There's no way she came up with that on her own." "My dad's on the school board," another voice added. "He says they had to accept her because of her father's donation to the new science wing. Diversity looks good for funding, you know." Grace's hands trembled slightly as she cleaned her beakers, but she kept working. Each insult was another brick in the foundation of her determination. She'd learned to channel her frustration into her work, making each experiment more precise, each conclusion more thoroughly researched. At home, her father noticed the growing stack of research papers on her desk. "That's a lot of extra reading, sunshine," he commented one evening, concern touching his voice. "I have to be twice as good to be considered half as capable," Grace replied, not looking up from her notes. She missed the way her father's face fell, the way his hands clenched briefly before relaxing. The following week, Grace found her research notebook soaked through with water, left mysteriously open near a leaking ceiling tile. Years of scientific observation told her this was no accident. The ceiling wasn't wet anywhere else. Instead of crying, she pulled out her phone and opened her digital backup files. She'd learned early on to photograph every page, every data point. Always have a backup plan, her mother had taught her. And a backup for your backup. During lunch that day, she noticed Rachel and her friends watching her, probably expecting to see defeat. Instead, Grace pulled out a fresh notebook and began rewriting her notes, her posture straight, her movements deliberate. She added new insights she'd gained since the original entries, making her research even stronger. As she wrote, she thought about her grandmother, whose battle with early-onset Alzheimer's had inspired this project. How she had faced her own battles with dignity, even as her memories slipped away. Sometimes, her grandmother had told her during a lucid moment, the biggest victory is simply showing up the next day, ready to try again. The bell rang, signaling the end of lunch. Grace packed up her things, noticing a small group of freshmen watching her from nearby. One girl offered a tiny, tentative smile, the first genuine smile she'd received from a student since starting here. It wasn't much, but it was something. A crack in the wall, and Grace knew from her chemistry studies that even the strongest structures could fall once the first crack appeared. She smiled back, squared her shoulders, and headed to her next class. They might have tried to drown her research, but they didn't know she'd learned to swim long ago. The state science fair was just 3 weeks away, and Grace's project was finally coming together. Late afternoon sunlight streamed through the laboratory windows as she carefully examined her latest test results. The data was promising. She'd identified several potential early warning signs for neurodegenerative diseases that current tests might miss. This could actually help people, she whispered to herself, reviewing her charts. Her grandmother's face flashed in her mind, and she felt that familiar mix of determination and purpose that had driven her research for months. A noise at the door made her look up. Rachel and 2 other members of the science club stood there, their expressions unreadable. "We need the lab," Rachel announced, not quite meeting Grace's eyes. "We have priority access for competition prep." Grace knew this wasn't true. She'd memorized the lab schedule, but she began packing up anyway. As she carefully stored her samples in the refrigerator, she noticed Rachel examining her research notes with unusual interest. The next morning, Grace arrived early to continue her work, only to find her experiment in ruins. Her carefully cultivated cell cultures were contaminated, months of work destroyed. The incubator temperature had been changed, and several crucial samples were missing entirely. She stood there, hands shaking as she documented the damage with her phone's camera. The janitor found her like that, still taking pictures, tears silently rolling down her cheeks. "You know," the older man said quietly, pausing in his morning routine, "my daughter's a scientist too. She always says the best discoveries come after the biggest setbacks." He offered her a kind smile and a clean cloth to wipe her eyes. Grace managed a weak smile in return. "Thank you, Mr. Rodriguez." She straightened her lab coat and began cleaning up the mess. She had 3 weeks to salvage her project, and she wasn't about to give up. That evening, her parents noticed something was wrong the moment she got home. "Baby, what happened?" her mother asked, taking in Grace's exhausted appearance. Grace finally let out everything: the sabotage, the months of isolation, the whispered comments. Her father listened silently, his doctor's hands clenched tight around his coffee mug. "Maybe I should just withdraw from the competition," Grace finished, staring at her untouched dinner. "They've made it pretty clear they don't want me there." Her mother reached across the table and took her hand. "Do you remember what happened when you were 7 and wanted to join the swim team? Those kids said you couldn't because your hair was different." Grace nodded, remembering. "And what did you do?" "I became team captain," Grace whispered, a small smile forming. "That's right. And you changed the rules so the swim caps would work for everyone's hair." Her mother squeezed her hand. "Sometimes being first means being lonely, but it also means opening doors for others." That night, Grace stayed up late, reviewing her backup data and research notes. She'd kept detailed records of everything, including photos of each stage of her experiments. It wasn't all lost, it was just a detour. The next few days became a blur of activity. Grace arrived at school early and stayed late, rebuilding her project from scratch. She borrowed her father's old laptop and set it up to record her lab station continuously, the camera running whenever she wasn't there. She also started keeping her most important samples at home, using her father's medical cooler to transport them safely. "Better safe than sorry," she muttered, carefully labeling each container. A week before the science fair, Grace was working late again when she overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. Through the partially open door of the prep room, Rachel's voice carried clearly, "It's perfect. We'll present the same research, but better. She'll look like she copied us." "But won't she say something?" Another voice asked nervously. "Who'll believe her? It's her word against the whole science club. Besides, we have more complete data now." Grace felt her chest tighten. They hadn't just sabotaged her work, they'd stolen it. But as the initial shock wore off, a calm determination settled over her. She pulled out her phone and opened her research folder filled with time-stamped photos, videos, and detailed notes going back months. Then she opened her email and began composing a message to Dr. Chen, her father's colleague at the university. She attached her original project proposal, early research notes, and preliminary findings, all dated well before the sabotage. "Dear Dr. Chen," she typed, "I would greatly appreciate your expert opinion on my research methodology and findings to date." She wasn't going to accuse anyone. She was simply going to prove, beyond any doubt, that this work was hers. As she walked to her father's car that evening, Grace felt lighter somehow. For the first time since the sabotage, she knew she would be okay. Not because she could stop them from stealing her work, but because she had already won something more important than any science fair prize. She had refused to let them steal her dignity. "How was your day?" her father asked as she buckled her seatbelt. Grace smiled, thinking of her email to Dr. Chen. "Let's just say I learned something interesting about chemical reactions, Dad. Sometimes you have to add a catalyst to get the truth to come out." The morning of the science fair presentation practice started like any other. Grace sat quietly in the back of the auditorium, watching as Rachel and her team set up their display. Using her research, her ideas, her months of hard work, she held her own presentation folder tightly, waiting for her turn. Just then, a commotion erupted near the entrance. Rachel's younger brother Michael, a freshman, had collapsed during his PE class. The gym teacher carried him in, looking for the school nurse. "He just fell during warm-ups," the teacher explained, his voice tight with worry. Grace watched as Michael's body suddenly went rigid. Having spent months researching neurological conditions, she recognized the signs immediately. This wasn't a simple fainting spell, it was the onset of a rare type of seizure she'd studied in her research. Without hesitation, Grace rushed forward, her presentation folder forgotten. "Get him on his side," she called out, already moving to help. "Someone time this, it's important for the doctors to know how long it lasts." The gym teacher looked startled but followed her instructions. Grace knelt beside Michael, speaking clearly to the gathering crowd. "I need space and something soft for his head." She turned to Rachel, who stood frozen in shock. "Has this happened before?" Rachel shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, never. What's happening to him?" "It's a particular type of seizure," Grace explained calmly, placing her rolled-up jacket under Michael's head. "I've studied these in my research. The good news is, if we handle it correctly, he'll be okay." She turned to the school secretary who had just arrived. "Call an ambulance, but tell them specifically it looks like temporal lobe epilepsy with secondary generalization." The onset was sudden, with initial muscle rigidity. The secretary repeated the terms into her phone, while Grace continued monitoring Michael's condition. She noticed his breathing pattern changing. "The seizure's about to intensify," she warned everyone. "Stay back, but keep timing." Rachel grabbed Grace's arm. "How do you know all this?" "It's what my research project was actually about," Grace replied, her eyes never leaving Michael. "Early detection of neurological conditions. I've been studying various types of seizures and their warning signs. The way he fell in PE, that was actually an early indicator that most people miss." The paramedics arrived within minutes. Grace quickly briefed them on what she'd observed, using precise medical terminology that made the principal's eyebrows rise in surprise. As they loaded Michael into the ambulance, one paramedic turned to Grace. "That was impressive work, young lady. Your quick recognition of the seizure type will help the doctors treat him much more effectively." Rachel stood watching the ambulance drive away, still shaking. She turned to Grace, her face a mix of emotions. I don't understand. After everything, why did you help him?" Grace gathered her things quietly. "Because it was the right thing to do, and because no one should have to watch their brother suffer when there's something they can do about it." The science fair practice was forgotten as news of the incident spread through the school. By lunch, the story had evolved to include how Grace's research, her actual research, not the stolen version, had helped identify Michael's condition early enough for proper treatment. That afternoon, Grace received an email from the hospital where Michael had been taken. The neurologist wanted to discuss her research findings, noting that her observations about early warning signs matched what they'd found in Michael's case. Rachel found Grace in the library after school. Her eyes were red from crying, but her voice was steady. "The doctors said, they said if we hadn't known what type of seizure it was right away, the treatment would have been delayed, and it could have been much worse." She took a deep breath. "You saved my brother, even after we—" "Maybe," Grace suggested gently, "we could focus on what happens next instead of what happened before." Rachel nodded, wiping her eyes. "I told the science club everything. About taking your research, about the sabotage. They're meeting tomorrow to decide what to do." She pulled out a familiar notebook, Grace's original research journal that had gone missing. "I think this belongs to you." As Grace took the notebook, she noticed her hands weren't shaking anymore. The same hands that had helped save Michael were now reclaiming her work, her truth. Sometimes, she realized, the biggest changes don't come from grand gestures or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes they come from simply being who you are when it matters most. Later that evening, as Grace updated her research notes with new observations from Michael's case, her phone buzzed with a text from Rachel. "The doctors want to include your research in their treatment plan. And I'm so sorry. For everything." Grace looked at the message for a long moment before replying. "How about we start fresh? Your brother's case actually gave me some new ideas for the research. If you're interested, I could use a lab partner who understands why this work matters." She set her phone down and smiled, remembering something her grandmother used to say. "The heart that helps others is the heart that heals itself." Today, in the midst of crisis, barriers had crumbled that months of conflict had only strengthened, and that, she realized, was the most important discovery of all. Word spread quickly through Riverside Prep about what had happened in the auditorium. By the next morning, the story of how Grace's research had helped save Michael had reached every corner of the school. But more importantly, people were talking about what had happened afterward. The science club held an emergency meeting before classes. Rachel stood before her peers, her voice trembling but determined. "What we did was wrong," she announced to the silent room. "We didn't just steal research, we tried to destroy someone's hard work because we were scared of change. And look what that research did. It saved my brother." The club advisor, Mr. Phillips, sat at his desk, his face ashen as Rachel detailed everything. The sabotage, the stolen research, the months of exclusion. When she finished, he removed his glasses and wiped them slowly. "I owe everyone an apology," he said finally, "especially Grace. As a teacher, I should have seen what was happening. Instead, I looked the other way." During morning assembly, the principal made an unexpected announcement. "Yesterday, we witnessed something extraordinary," she began, "not just the quick thinking that helped save a student's life, but a reminder of why diversity in our school isn't just about appearances. It's about bringing different perspectives, experiences, and knowledge together." Grace sat in the back, trying not to draw attention to herself, but she could feel the atmosphere in the room changing. Students who had never spoken to her were turning in their seats, offering small smiles and nods of acknowledgement. Between classes, Rachel caught up with Grace at her locker. "The science club wants to make things right," she said, shifting nervously. "We're recommending your original research for the state competition, and we'd like you to join the club. Not as a new member, but as co-president." Grace considered this for a moment. "On one condition," she replied. "We open up membership to everyone who's passionate about science, not just the usual crowd. There's a freshman girl in my chemistry class who has amazing ideas about renewable energy." Rachel smiled, really smiled, for the first time in their conversations. "Deal. Actually, I was thinking, maybe we could start a mentoring program for middle school students interested in science, especially kids who might not think they belong in a place like Riverside Prep." During lunch, Grace was surprised to find her usual solitary table gradually filling up. A group of students from her classes tentatively asked if they could join her. "We heard you're starting a study group for the biology midterm," one girl said hopefully. "Would it be okay if we joined?" As Grace looked around the table, she saw genuine interest in their faces. No forced politeness, no hidden agendas, just fellow students who had finally begun to see her as one of their own. The transformation wasn't limited to students. Teachers who had previously overlooked her raised hands now actively sought her input. Mr. Phillips asked her to give a special presentation to his advanced chemistry class about her research methods. In the library, Grace found the librarian reorganizing the science section. "I'm creating a new display," she explained, focusing on groundbreaking research by scientists from diverse backgrounds. "Would you help me select some books that inspired your work?" After school, Grace stayed late to work on her project, but this time she wasn't alone. Rachel and several other science club members worked alongside her, their excitement growing as they discovered new patterns in her data. "Look at this correlation," Rachel pointed out, genuinely engaged. "If we could develop a screening tool based on these early indicators, it could help so many families catch problems early." Grace watched her former adversary become one of her strongest advocates. It wasn't just about the research anymore, it was about breaking down barriers that had stood for far too long. That evening, as Grace packed up her books, she found a note slipped into her locker. It was from a 6th grade girl who had attended their first science club outreach session. "Thank you for showing me that I can be a scientist too." At home, Grace's parents noticed the change in their daughter. The tension she'd carried for months had lifted. "You're smiling more," her mother observed over dinner. "Things are different now," Grace explained. "It's like everyone finally remembered we're all just kids trying to figure things out. The walls came down when we stopped seeing each other as threats and started seeing each other as people." Her father nodded wisely. "Sometimes it takes a crisis to remind us of our common humanity, but it takes special people to turn that moment into lasting change." Later that night, Grace added a new section to her research journal. But instead of scientific observations, she wrote about the other experiment that had taken place at Riverside Prep. The one that proved how quickly prejudice could dissolve when people opened their hearts and minds. As she got ready for bed, her phone lit up with messages from her new study group, sharing jokes and planning tomorrow's session. Grace smiled, remembering her grandmother's words. "Change comes slowly, then all at once, like a sunrise. You just have to be brave enough to wait for dawn." The State Science Fair was being held in the grand ballroom of the city's convention center. Hundreds of projects lined the aisles, but the crowd around Grace's presentation was three deep. Her research on early detection of neurological conditions had caught the attention of not just the judges, but several university representatives as well. "And that's when we noticed the pattern," Grace explained to the riveted audience, gesturing to her detailed charts. "These subtle signs often appear months before traditional diagnostic tests show anything unusual." Rachel stood beside her, handling the technical demonstrations while Grace spoke. A judge raised his hand. "This is graduate-level research. How did you verify your findings?" Grace smiled and pulled up a slide. "Actually, we have a case study. With his family's permission, we've included data from a recent incident at our school." She explained Michael's case and how the early warning signs she'd identified had helped with his diagnosis and treatment. The university representatives exchanged impressed looks. One of them, a neurologist from a prestigious medical school, stepped forward. "Young lady, would you be interested in joining our summer research program? This work could help thousands of families." As Grace discussed the possibility, she noticed Rachel wiping away tears. "Happy tears," Rachel whispered when Grace gave her a concerned look. "I just keep thinking, if we hadn't tried to stop you, my brother might not be okay right now." The awards ceremony that afternoon was packed. When they announced the winners, Grace barely registered her name being called for first place. What caught her attention was the judge's commentary. "This project not only demonstrates exceptional scientific rigor, but also shows the real-world impact of innovative research." Back at school the next day, the atmosphere was electric. Local news stations had picked up the story, not just of Grace's win, but of how her research had already saved a life. The principal called an assembly to recognize the achievement. But the real victory, the principal said, isn't just in the science fair results. It's in how this project has transformed our school community. She gestured to where Michael sat with his family, healthy and smiling. "It's in the lessons we've learned about judging less and listening more." During lunch, Grace's table was now the busiest in the cafeteria. Students from all grades stopped by to ask questions about her research, share ideas, or just be part of the excitement. The conversation flowed freely, touching on everything from science to music to dreams for the future. "You know what's really cool?" one freshman said between bites of a sandwich. "My little sister's school heard about what happened here. They're starting their own science club, and they're making sure everyone feels welcome from day one." Grace looked around the table, remembering how lonely it had felt just a few months ago. Now, the faces around her reflected every background imaginable, all united by curiosity and enthusiasm. After school, Mr. Phillips asked Grace to stay behind. "Major universities are calling," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "They're not just interested in your research. They want to know about our school's new approach to inclusive science education." Grace thought about the changes she'd seen. The science club had tripled in size, with students who never thought they belonged in science discovering their passion. The mentoring program for middle schoolers was flourishing, with Rachel leading many of the sessions. That evening, Grace visited her grandmother in the hospital. As she explained her research findings, she noticed the doctors paying close attention. One of them pulled her aside afterward. "We've started implementing some of your early detection protocols," she explained. 2 patients have already been flagged for preventive treatment because of it. At home, Grace found an email from the State Education Board. They wanted her to speak at their annual conference about making science education more inclusive. "They want us all to present," she told her parents excitedly. "Me, Rachel, the whole team. They say our story shows how diversity in science isn't just about fairness, it's about making breakthrough discoveries that help everyone." Her mother hugged her tightly. "You did more than prove them wrong, baby. You showed them a better way forward." Later that night, as Grace updated her research journal, she found herself writing more than just scientific observations. "Today I learned that the biggest experiments don't happen in labs," she wrote. "They happen in human hearts. And when they succeed, they don't just change data points, they change lives." Her phone buzzed with a message from Rachel. "Hey, the middle school kids want to know if you'll help judge their first science fair next week. They say they want to be just like you when they grow up." Grace smiled as she typed her reply. A few months ago, she'd been the outsider they tried to push away. Now, she was the example they wanted others to follow. It wasn't just about winning a science fair anymore, it was about showing everyone that when you break down barriers, you don't just change one school or help one person. You start a chain reaction that keeps spreading, touching life after life, proving that the most powerful catalyst for change is simply believing in yourself and refusing to give up. On graduation day, the Riverside Preparatory Academy's auditorium was packed to capacity. Sunlight streamed through the high windows, catching the gold tassels of the graduates' caps. As valedictorian, Grace stood at the podium, looking out at a sea of faces that had changed so much over the past year. "When I first walked through these doors," she began, her voice clear and strong, "I was alone. I thought my biggest challenge would be keeping up with the academics." Gentle laughter rippled through the crowd. Everyone knew she'd set new academic records at the school. "Instead, I learned that the greatest experiments don't always happen in laboratories. Sometimes they happen in hallways, in cafeterias, in moments when we choose to see each other as people rather than stereotypes." In the audience, Rachel sat with her family, including Michael, who was now helping run the middle school science program Grace had started. Next to them were dozens of younger students from their mentoring initiative, proudly wearing their Future Scientists t-shirts. "Our class set out to prove something this year," Grace continued. "Not just that early detection of neurological conditions could save lives, though our research is already doing that in hospitals across the state." She paused, smiling at her grandmother who sat in her wheelchair in the front row, beaming with pride. "We proved that when you break down walls, you don't just free the people on the outside, you free everyone." Our science club grew from 20 students to over 100. Our mentoring program now reaches 5 middle schools. And next year, Riverside Prep will welcome the most diverse freshman class in its history. The principal nodded from her seat on stage, remembering the long meetings where they'd rewritten admissions policies, created new scholarships, and transformed the school's approach to inclusion. But the real change, Grace said, her voice softening, happened in small moments. It happened when someone who once turned away decided to turn back and say hello. It happened when students who'd never spoken to each other discovered they shared the same dreams. It happened when we all realized that excellence doesn't come from exclusion, it comes from embracing every voice, every perspective, every story. She gestured to the banner hanging above the stage, announcing the school's new scholarship program, named not after her, as the board had suggested, but after her grandmother. The Future Builders Fund would help students from all backgrounds attend Riverside Prep. Today, as we graduate, we're not just celebrating our academic achievements. We're celebrating the experiment that worked better than any of us could have imagined, the discovery that when you give people a chance to prove you wrong about them, they might end up proving you wrong about yourself too. In the audience, teachers who had once overlooked her raised hands now wiped away tears. Mr. Phillips, who had become one of her strongest supporters, clutched a letter from the State Education Board praising the school's new science program. After the ceremony, families mingled in the courtyard. Grace found herself surrounded by younger students asking for photos and advice. A small girl tugged at her graduation gown. "My big sister says you changed everything," she said shyly. "She says now I can come here too, when I'm older." Grace knelt down to the girl's level. "You absolutely can. And you know what? You might change everything too." Later, at the celebration dinner, Rachel raised her glass in a toast. "To the person who taught us that the best kind of change doesn't tear things down, it builds them up. Who showed us that revenge isn't as powerful as forgiveness, and that the smartest person in the room isn't always the one with all the answers. Sometimes it's the one asking the right questions." As the evening wound down, Grace walked through the school hallways one last time. The display cases that once held only certain names now showcased achievements from every corner of the student body. The science lab where she faced so much resistance was now a hub of collaboration and innovation. She paused at her old locker, remembering the lonely girl who had once stood there, clutching her books like a shield. That girl could never have imagined how things would change, how pain would transform into purpose, how exclusion would become inclusion. Her phone buzzed with an email from the university where she'd be starting in the fall. They wanted her to help design a high school outreach program based on the model she'd created at Riverside. "Your experience," they wrote, "shows how one person's journey can reshape an entire community." As she left the building, Grace saw her parents waiting in the car, proud smiles on their faces. Next to them was her grandmother, whose battle with early-onset Alzheimer's had inspired the research that changed everything. The latest trials of her early detection protocol were showing promising results in hospitals nationwide. Looking back at the school one last time, Grace thought about all the students who would walk through those doors in the years to come. They would find not just an excellent education, but a community that had learned the most valuable lesson of all, that our differences aren't obstacles to overcome, but gifts to embrace. The setting sun painted the school buildings in warm golden light, and Grace smiled, knowing that while her time at Riverside Prep was ending, the changes she'd helped create were just beginning. Sometimes the biggest breakthroughs happen not in labs or libraries, but in the simple, brave act of being yourself, even when it feels like you're standing alone. Because eventually you discover that you were never really alone at all. You were just the first in line of many who would follow, each adding their own light to the dawn of a new day.